This is the tale of a swindler, cunning and infamous. The knight cut a menacing figure. The sight of his weapon conjured images of rent flesh, and the sound of snapping bone. His armor was no less imposing, forged in the shape of a jet black wolf. Its keen stare transfixed any prey it fell upon. Most opponents knelt, cowering at his feet before the first blade was drawn, more often than not. The wolf knight was victorious without even fighting. The lupine armor was the result of years of careful experimentation. If perfected, he knew it would serve as a fine weapon. In truth, it was his only weapon, or the only one he knew how to use. All his skill and effort went into intimidation. In a word, he was a con man who worked the battlefield. He never had a master to teach him combat. He was orphaned before he knew his parents' faces. He'd had to find a way to survive alone. And the answer he came to was deceit. Despite his efforts, he left one battle gravely wounded. Serves him right, he thought. For heeding his opponent's taunts and fighting head-on, he fled to the mountains, escaping with his life, but soon found himself lost. As his hunger grew, he felt death's creeping approach. As he wandered, he came upon a cabin. Despite its remoteness, it was quite nicely appointed. His swindler's instincts took hold. If there was someone inside, anyone, he knew he could fool them. Within the cabin lived an old woman, face hidden by his helm. The wolf knight demanded she bring him food. He kept his voice a low growl, icy cold with just a hint of madness. It was a tone he'd practiced for years. Put another way, it was the only tone he knew how to strike with others. After a moment spent nonplussed, the old woman hurried to prepare a meal. She was kind, strangely so. The wolf knight assumed he'd cowed her into submission. He decided to capitalize on her fear and extend his stay there, just as he hoped. She prepared feast after feast for him. Doubt began to creep in. She was too genial to be acting on fear alone. Several days into his stay, the old woman cooked up the grandest meal yet. As the knight sat down, however, he noted she was nowhere in sight. Thinking she'd left on some errand, he cleaned the table single-handedly. Clutching his gut in contentment, he then noticed a letter. What he read in it sent a shiver up his spine. The old woman's provisions had run out, and so she'd fashioned this final meal from her own flesh. The warm, heavy weight now in his belly was his erstwhile host. He broke out in a panic sweat and hastened to continue reading. Why show him such extreme hospitality? Was it really for fear of him? No, certainly not. She'd had a son, she explained. Though they'd been parted years ago, the wolf knight was the spitting image of her boy, full grown. It was all there in her letter. She couldn't help but think of him as her son, nor bear the thought of her child going hungry. In the end, she was happy, as if she'd been reunited at last. Amid her talk of the child she'd lost, she gave the boy's name. The knight cried out, for the name she'd written was his own. Not the alias he'd given her, but the true name he'd kept hidden. Then she was his, an orphan all his life. He'd finally met his mother and devoured her. He'd imagined his parents' faces countless times. Had they been in his life, he'd never have become the fraud he was. He'd pined for them, ached for them. His mind was in chaos. This was surely some nightmare. His mother lay in his belly now, being digested. He tried to vomit her up, yet no matter how many times he retched, he could not purge the guilt that clung to his gut. In the end, he slit open his belly and tore out his viscera. Trying to remove his mother by hand, from his entrails, a skull emerged. It spoke to him, in the old woman's voice.
Had you fooled, didn't I?
The furnishings around him turned to ash, then the walls. The cabin crumbled. This is the tale of a swindler, cunning and infamous. The knight had been in an illusion from the start. The old woman was a witch, and a cleverer crook than the knight. And small wonder, for he lacked her experience. She'd had a dozen lifetimes to practice her schemes. She lured others into consuming her, then claimed their bodies, passing from host to host forever. The immortal Red Hood, even in this world ruled by sorcery, few are those who find an ending life. She was proud exception.